Our next reader is John Everson. He's the Bram Stoker award-winning author of Covenant, as well as the novels Sacrifice, The 13th, Siren, and The Pumpkin Man. His sixth novel, an erotic horror descent into dark desires centered around a mysterious adult club called Nightwear, will be released by Samhain in summer 2012. Over the past 20 years, his short stories have appeared in more than 75 magazines and anthologies. His work has been translated into Polish, Italian, Turkish, and French, an option for potential film production.
Sarah, he's got books to sell.
Oh, and he's got books to sell too. He is also the founder and publisher of the independent press Dark Arts Books. Please welcome John Everson.
I don't know. How do you follow dolphin rape? I have a novel called Siren. I do. It's not what I'm going to read for you. Quite a while ago, a long time ago, as I was telling Bill, there was a Chicago reading series called Twilight Tales. And I did a bunch of stories with them. They actually published my second collection. I'm going to read a quickie for you out of that. Unfortunately, Twilight Tales disappeared before my novels started coming out, so I didn't get to read a lot of those. So I'm going to read a little short for you tonight because I always like to leave people with a full story, and then I'm going to give you a quick teaser for my current novel, The Pumpkin Man. So this story is called The Right Instrument. It has no dolphins at all. Jack's elbows slammed on the plastic synthesizer keys in defeat, earning a chaotic crash from the speakers. Every C major chord diminished to an A minor, every G to an E flat minor. His stalled jingle for Carter's Beans was a lamed sunrise sunset. "It's Karen's fault," he bitched at Crazy Eddie. "I can't write without her. I need her to make music now." 3 months ago, Karen had pushed Jack over for an aerobics instructor. Since then, his freelance jingle writing business had hit the skids big time. Who wanted to try selling products with tunes that made consumers want to cry? Eddie only nodded in that crazy way he had, shag carpet eyebrows waffling creepily. "All you need is the right instrument," he'd said. Jack stared at the Korg M1 beneath his elbows and shook his head. There was nothing wrong with the instrument. The problem was him, his head. His inability to get over the fact that the best thing that had ever happened to him was over, done, screwing another guy. After their breakup, Jack had begged for another chance. Her eyes answered with the sort of look you'd give a mortally wounded dog. "I can't, Jack," was all she'd say. She wouldn't even return his phone calls anymore. Lately, messages on her answering machine brought no reply, but as he hung up the phone each time, he could hear her saying it over and over again. "I can't, Jack." The doorbell rang, and with a groan, Jack shoved himself up. Crazy Eddie's too close eyes and skewed nose peered distortedly through the door's peephole. "Why am I friends with this nutcase?" Jack asked himself for the 1,000th time, but turned the knob. If nothing else, Eddie was loyal. Strange, twisted, but loyal as a hound. "Got something for you, Jack." Eddie motioned to someone outside. "Bring it." "What's going on?" "You needed the right instrument, so I made it for you." 4 grunting men carried it through Jack's door. "Next to the other one." Eddie pointed toward the keyboard. They set down an upright piano, brought in a bench, and left. "Sit," Eddie commanded. "Play." It was a beautiful instrument, stained a deep oak and glossed with rich varnish. The keys themselves, though slightly notched and uneven at their edges, had not yet yellowed with age. They were obviously newer than the rest of the piano. A reconditioned antique? Eddie, this is too much, really. It must have cost... "Play, Jack. It was cheap. I bought it from a junk shop, refurnished it myself, carved new keys." Still unsure, Jack touched the keys. A deep F chord emerged, then a bright G. The tones were marvelous. Jack smiled and launched a complex run of scalar ascensions. He lost himself in the warmth of the sound and unconsciously slid into the stalled bean jingle. Instead of slumming in minor keys, however, He suddenly knew the transition it needed, and instantly the tune clicked. "This is amazing, Eddie. I've been dicking around with this jingle for a week, and there it is, just like that." "You just needed the right instrument," Eddie winked. A week passed, then another. Jack's love for the piano crescendoed. Maybe he'd just become incapable of working on sterile synthesizers, he mused. The feel of running his fingers over the heavy keys, the resistance to tactile differences, they changed the experience of playing for him. The now jaunty bean jingle sold, which allowed him to just make his rent payment. More and more catchy hooks rolled off his fingers to the keys every day. He could barely get one written down before another idea struck. When Crazy Eddie stopped by again, Jack greeted him with a bear hug. "Thanks, Eddie, really. I guess I didn't need Karen around at all. I just needed a new instrument." Eddie's lips split apart for a crooked smile. "No," he said. "You needed the right instrument. A keyboard that kept Karen close to you at all times." Jack frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Well, I told you I carved those keys myself, Jack, but I didn't tell you out of what, and I certainly can't afford ivory." Jack turned to the piano, eyes squinting in confusion at the rippled, uneven row of creamy keys. "Then what?" "Oh, I strangled her with piano wire. It was easy. It seemed appropriate. She was made for this, for you. I carved her bones smooth as balsa. Now every note you play channels through Karen." Jack gasped, and Eddie patted him on the back. "She sounds good, doesn't she?" That's my little ode to Twilight Zone. Okay, so for this year, my novel The Pumpkin Man came out in October. Looking at this cover, you might say, Pumpkin Man, jack-o'-lantern, this book has a Halloween sort of vibe, right? It actually has nothing to do with Halloween. The story takes place in June, July, in the coast of California. But it does have to do with a guy who manages to carve people's faces into jack-o'-lanterns and leave those in place of the heads that he removes from them. Just a little teaser. This is the prologue. Meredith took the man's hands in hers and gave it a reassuring squeeze. She'd worked a long time to bring him here. His palms were clammy. She could smell his fear. He had every reason to be afraid. But she needed him for this. She couldn't afford for him to back out now, and he owed her too much to leave. Not when she was this close. Not on this night. She would not wait another year until it came around again. Candles flickered and smoked all around them. The room smelled of beeswax and sage. Before he arrived, she had lit 6 candles and placed them in a line to the north, and then 6 more to the south. Finally, 6 more to the east. A perfect number in an imperfect shape. They formed a U around the small table in her living room. The opening pointed toward the door, an entry point. She did not intend for there to be an exit. "Put your fingers on the wood," she urged her unwilling accomplice. His eyes looked glossy and wet in the wavering orange light. He might have been about to cry, or it could have been the thickness of his glasses that magnified the light. "Gently," she said, "just the tips, next to mine." Together they touched the edges of the planchette, and Meredith took George's clothes, laid out next to the table, inside the U. They were the last things her husband had worn, and the rents in the shirt were still stained with his blood. She looked at his carving knives, rusting now with disuse. She remembered the day she had given them to him, the joy they had sparked in his eyes, and then the guilt. How could they afford them, he'd wondered. Meredith had smiled at the distant memory. She'd saved for months and secretly driven all the way to San Francisco to buy them. Then she anointed them with the dark words and the contents of one of the secret family jars tucked away in the basement. For a long time, they had brought him happiness before the magic turned dark. "Don't speak," she cautioned. "Don't take your fingers away from the wood. Just let it work through you." She closed her eyes to the mementos of George and remembered him as he'd been in life, broad and quiet, eyes shadowed, but always tender to her. Others had seen differently. They had persecuted him, called him evil. Eyes shut and locked on the memory of her husband holding her close in the kitchen of their house, her fingers touching the planchette, Meredith called out to the room. Spirits close and spirits far, call for me to my beloved. Bring him here to where we are. Let us speak more from beyond the end. Bring to me my dearest friend. Outside, the wind howled, crashing the shutters hard against the windows of the small cottage. A storm was due by midnight. Appropriate that on the night Meredith needed to reach beyond death, the skies boiled dark and angry. Inside, the candles flickered as the drafts blown in from the ocean slipped through the cracks in the windows and doors. Are you with us? Meredith asked. There was no answer but the wind. Spirits close and spirits far, she called out again to the small room. Her voice echoed strangely. I've served you all my life. Bring my George to where we are. Let him speak to me, his wife. There is no end to love and death. We are one and two, separate only by breath. The wood seemed to tremble beneath her fingers, and Meredith's lips trembled in a faint smile. Are you with us? She asked a second time. The wood ring moved beneath her fingers, and Meredith opened her eyes to see it stop at the upper left corner of the wooden board. It rested on top of the word yes. I found a way to bring you back, she said. The wood darted to the opposite side of the board. She almost lost her connection to it. Looking at her partner, she saw sweat bead on his forehead. His eyes bulged as they followed the seemingly independent movement of the planchette. But he did not take his fingers from their place next to hers. We can be together again, she promised, and you can teach them all a lesson. The wood ring slipped from letter to letter across the board. Beneath the yes and no, a full alphabet was painted. The ring stopped first on S and then on O. And then it spelled out M-U-C-H, much. It paused for a moment and then quickly moved through the letters B-L-O-O-D. So much blood. Yes, she whispered. But I need you. I've always needed you. The wood moved to the P and then the A and the I and the N. Just a little, she whispered. With one hand, she lifted the candle at the edge of the U and dribbled its wax across the opening, closing the entrance, all the while keeping one finger to the planchette. You are with us now and forevermore, she said. My love to blind you, my love to blind you, my blood to bind you. With those words, she lifted one of George's knives and lightly drew its blade across the wrist of her hand that still touched the planchette. Blood dripped across the board, spotting the knives with crimson, and the wind outside gusted and cried. Meredith murmured a sentence in an ancient tongue, and then said it again, louder, fighting to be heard above the howls. Then she switched to her own tongue and said the words she'd longed to mouth for months. Make them rue the day they hurt you, my strength yours as long as you can. Stay with me and make them regret the day they hurt the pumpkin man. At last, her partner made a sound. He screamed and pulled away from the witchboard. The front door burst open and the wind finally found its way inside. All the candles blew out at once, leaving Meredith smiling in the darkness. So that's sort of the teaser to how Meredith brought the Pumpkin Man back into this world. And the novel is actually about two teachers from Chicago who are rift and inherit this cottage out in California and go out there and suddenly find themselves in the middle of a spree of strange occult murders and have to figure out what's going on and why they're connected to it. I do have copies and I hope you'll check it out. It was fun to write and thanks for having me.